Chapter 2. Integration. Sana stopped breathing. She dropped back and sat dumbly, staring at the body as the nanobots swirled around her. It didn't seem real. She felt the urge to retch and lifted her hands to cover her mouth, but the sight and smell of blood on them made it worse, and she scrambled away from the corpse on all fours. The nanobots buzzed around her in a frantic dance. She had to get away. It was the only clear thought in her head. The noise of the nanobots was making it hard to think. She slammed her hands over her ears and tore out of the alley, leaving her jacket strewn over Lord Static's leg and a fading trail of bloody footprints in her wake. The route back home was a blur. She remembered clipping a few corners, tripping twice, and a horrible, incessant, droning hum, but the details of how she wound up on her bathroom floor, shaking and throwing up into the toilet, were forever lost to her. Once her body had decided that her internals were sufficiently external, she used the sink to push herself into a position that could be called standing if one was being generous. In truth, her arms were providing more support than her legs, and she was trembling like a chihuahua with alcohol withdrawal. She caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and saw her face blurred out. A fresh bolt of panic shot through her, and she ripped the crown off her head and threw it into the hall, where it landed with a muffled thunk. Her own features snapped into clarity. Even with the bots obscuring parts of her face, she saw how pale she was, the scratch on her forehead that had dripped blood to her eyebrow, and the haunted look in her reflection's gray eyes. Worst, she saw the bloody fingerprint on her forehead and the smears on her cheeks. They burned, and she scrubbed at her face until it was raw. The white washcloth went red, then pink, then red again as the cut on her forehead reopened. Frigid, pink-tinted water dripped over her eyes and onto the floor. Sana finally gave up. The washcloth fell into the sink with a sad plop, and she shut off the water. The blood on her hands was long gone, but she could still feel traces lingering in the scars she'd earned cutting stained glass. She flexed her fingers a few times, which didn't alleviate the sensation. With the noise from the faucet gone and no other distractions, there was nothing blocking out the buzz of the nanotech. Sana once again covered her ears with the balls of her hands. The pressure bordered on pain. Her hands were still dripping wet, and the effect on the volume was negligible. Strands of her hair were clumped in a way that suggested dried blood. She screwed her eyes shut and slumped into a squat, with her knees to her chest and her forehead resting on the door of the cabinet under the sink. She fumbled for the star-shaped pendant she was wearing and rubbed the smooth glass between her index finger and thumb. In addition, she tugged on the chain until it bit into the back of her neck, then tugged harder. It was an old self-soothing mechanism that had gotten her through more unpleasant conversations than she could remember. The delicate links couldn't handle the stress. The chain snapped, and Sana's fist flew forward, while the rest of her went the other way. Her free hand fell back, but landed in a puddle of water and slipped out from under her. She flailed, and one of her feet caught the toilet paper holder, which fell over with the reverberating clang only a metal rod could achieve. She screwed her eyes shut in anticipation of her head bouncing off the tile, but the nanobot beanbag from earlier made a reappearance, and while the landing packed a punch, it was soft. Sana lay there, scared out of her mind and exhausted. The pendant's points dug into her hand, but instead of letting the necklace fall to the floor, she clenched it tighter. The points weren't sharp enough to pierce her skin, and the weight was grounding. The construct dissolved under her in a much less controlled manner than the first time. Sana ended up flat on her back, with the cold wetness of the tile seeping through the thin fabric of her shirt. She didn't move. Her strength had simply run out. All she could do was stare at the knotholes in the ceiling and the nanobots flying around her. A creaking of wood alerted her to another presence, and she let her head loll towards the door. To her surprise, it was the cats. The commotion from earlier must have brought them over to see what was going on. Bread, the tabby, had always been people-oriented, and he walked to his human to see what the problem was. Garlic, the calico, was the more aloof of the two, and she hung back in the doorway. At Bread's approach, the nanobots around Sana stopped moving erratically. They snapped into place, and construct spears formed, each pointed at the cat. Bread hissed defiantly at the odd pointy bugs and swatted at the closest one. Sana saw the spears pull back to strike at him. "No!" She dredged up enough energy to throw herself over Bread and curl around him, earning an irritated and a warning bite. She dropped the pendant. "Don't hurt him! Stop!" It was the first verbal order she'd issued to the nanobots, and the last condition needed for full integration to proceed. A coffin-sized dome snapped into existence around Sana and Bread, and nanobots tore the feline from her arms. She yelled and tried to keep hold of the squirming creature, but he was dragged out of a hole in the cocoon. She stopped hearing him once it snapped shut millimeters from her fingertips. "No!" She beat on the wall, which didn't do anything. It didn't stop her from trying. "Let me out! Don't hurt him! Don't—" It felt like getting hit by lightning. Every single one of Sana's muscles clenched at once, and she slammed into the opposite side of the dome as a result. She felt her heart stutter a split second before her front hit the floor, and a lance of pain shot through her, courtesy of the cut over her stomach. She pushed up as far as she could and wrapped her arm around the tender area. A thin layer of sweat had formed all over her body, and her breath was coming hard, scraping the inside of her throat. She couldn't see or hear, but her eyes and ears burned. She wailed in agony. The pain in her ears and eyes faded, replaced with a tingling, hot-cold feeling crawling across every inch of her skin. The dome was just barely big enough for Sana to curl into the fetal position, and she dug her fingernails into her calves and scratched hard enough to draw blood. The sensation crescendoed, then cut off. Sana was left in the dark, gasping for air and feeling the wet tickle of blood across her stomach and shins. She whined and uncurled to scratch at the dome. "Let me out," she whispered in a hoarse voice. To her shame, she was crying. "Please, let me out." The dome dissolved into individual nanobots. The harsh bathroom lighting that spilled over Sana had never been more welcome. She collapsed onto her side and her eyes slipped shut. The floor was still wet, cold, and gross, but the sensations, and the odd feeling of taking up more space than she had moments ago, couldn't beat the fatigue, and she slid into unconsciousness. She came to all at once. She sat up with a gasp, then held her head as the blood rush hit her. The vertigo subsided quickly, and she staggered to her feet with the sink as a crutch. One unsupported step forward proved that something else was seriously wrong. She placed her foot down, but wobbled when it didn't carry her the expected distance. It was as if she had grown larger than her true size and gone fuzzy around the edges. Her limbs were still there, but there was something else. It was less of a feeling and more of an awareness. She closed her eyes and held out her hand, then wiggled her fingers. She could tell where the nanobot cloud was in relation to her hand, the same way she could tell where her hand was in relation to her body. That had a name, didn't it? Prio something. She kept her eyes shut and lunged forward in an attempt to grab a nanobot. They scattered like a swarm of gnats, and she came up empty-handed. She tried again with her eyes open and got the same result. The things were tiny, and she knew where they were, but that didn't help much with where they were going to be. One of the bots flew past her nose, and her eyes locked on it. She swept for it, but missed. "Hold still," she thought. To her surprise, the bot she was focusing on stopped moving. It stayed in place even when she poked it, and it didn't fly away when she snatched it out of the air. She blinked in surprise. How come that worked? She asked herself. The bot hovered a half-inch above Sana's palm when she opened her fist. It seemed perfectly content to stay there and be examined. Upon lifting it to eye level, Sana observed that the bot was spherical, but it had jointed spikes sticking straight out at regular intervals along the body. The whole thing, spikes included, was a monochrome black. Little panels slid back and forth in rhythm, and the bot pulsed and vibrated in a pattern that made Sana dizzy. She lifted her hand back into the cloud and imagined the bot being swept back by the current. It behaved exactly as she envisioned. Lord Static's dying words danced through her head, and she shivered. Thoughts and emotions were uncontrollable things when they were locked in a mind. The more a thought was ignored or repressed, the more it pushed its way to the forefront. Emotions could be hidden, but they would be felt all the same. She was no sociopath. If imagination and feelings truly controlled the bots, Sana herself had far less control than she would like. With that unpleasant train of thoughts occupying her mental railroad, Sana shuffled out of the bathroom. Everything in there was starting to look like a deadly weapon, especially the mirror. The desire to get away from her own reflection had nothing to do with her retreat. She made it to the kitchen. Not a great place to be. Worse than the bathroom, honestly. Her eyes slid to the knife block, and a tendril of nanobots almost grabbed the handle of the biggest knife before she dragged her brain back. She glanced around for a distraction she could hang on to until she made it somewhere safer. Her gaze landed on the microwave clock, and the 4:23 displayed there all but smacked her across the face. Her dad was going to be home in less than 2 hours. He couldn't be here, not yet. She dug her phone out of her pocket and punched in her dad's cell number. As the phone rang, she thought of an excuse. Her dad picked up on the third ring. "Hi, honey. What's going on?" She forced a cheerful note into her voice and a smile onto her face. "Hey, Pops, would you mind grabbing some egg roll wrappers from the Asian market on your way home? I want to make some pizza logs for dinner." The market was all the way across Calabria from his workplace and the house. It might buy her an extra half hour. "Why? You never make dinner, and the menu's been planned for a week. What's going on?" "Damn it!" Sana fumbled for a reply. Anxiety churned in her gut, and the nanobots picked up speed. The buzzing grew louder, close to the volume necessary for the phone to pick it up. "I want to surprise Mom." "Your mother's taking the late shift. You know that. Now tell me what's really happening, or I'm coming home immediately." "Crap. It's nothing, really. Just don't be in a rush to get home tonight. It's nothing bad, I swear." "Try again." He wasn't going to budge. Sana closed her eyes and gave in to the inevitable. "I have a super weapon. Lord Static's nanobots." "I'll be home in 5 minutes." "No, it's okay. I've got it under control." The cloud had expanded with Sana's increasing agitation, and a cluster of the nanobots rammed into the butter dish and sent it crashing into the wall. She winced. "Disregard that?" 2 minutes. The call cut off before she could come up with a suitable reply. Another crash, this time the result of a cast-iron frying pan hitting the floor, and Sana beat a retreat to the living room. Anywhere else had too many breakables. She stood in the center of the room and focused on slowing her mind. It wasn't working. Without anything to act as a focus, the sensations caused by the bots eroded any composure she dredged up, and her train of thought careened along increasingly wild paths. She could feel the nanotech the way she could feel when someone was standing behind her, and the extra stimulus was unbearable. She tugged at her hair to distract herself. It didn't do much. The door flew open with a house-rattling slam. Sana jumped and rolled around, her heart doing backflips. It was her dad. He'd clearly sprinted home. His normally immaculate clothes and hair were in disarray, and he was breathing hard. He threw the door shut and demanded, "What happened?" He sounded angry. Sana knew that he was safe to be around, but the primal part of her brain was screaming, "Danger!" Her instincts didn't take into account their good relationship or the concern in his voice. "Get away!" she thought. The bots reacted. A spear larger than the ones that had menaced Bread earlier formed and flew straight at his heart. "No!" Sana screamed. She threw out a hand to grab the spear or knock it off course. She was too slow. but its trajectory changed anyway. It swerved away from her dad, who dropped, and it passed harmlessly over his shoulder to stick in the door. Sana watched it tremble from the force of the impact before it exploded into individual bots that flew back towards her. She stepped back and threw her arms up to cover her face, but the bots only rejoined the main cloud. Sana's dad picked himself up, though he left his laptop bag on the floor. "Sana, what was that?" "I'm sorry," she wailed. She wrapped her arms around herself, and the bots clustered tightly around her. "I can't stop them." "Okay, take it easy. We can figure this out." He held his arms in front of himself like he was asking for a hug. "Try coming to me first." She took a half step forward, then flinched back. "What if the bots lash out?" "I trust you." "I don't!" Her voice had gone sharp and angry. "These things almost killed Bread less than an hour ago. They electrocuted me right after. If that's my level of control, I'm liable to accidentally cripple you or worse." She'd started to cry. "I can't—" "Easy, Peanut. Deep breaths." Her dad took a few steps forward. The bots didn't go after him. Emboldened by this, he crossed half the distance and stretched out his arms again. His right hand was curled the way it had been since before Sana's birth, but the fingers of his left were spread in an invitation. "You won't hurt me. Come here. It's okay." "It's not!" She'd slipped into hysteria. The cloud of bots around her grew larger and manifested tendrils like whipping branches. They came close to hitting her dad, but each one swerved away before making contact. They struck the floor, scattered, and reformed. Not solid enough to cause damage. "I can't control them. I'm going to hurt you." "Have you hurt me yet?" He kept his voice low and even. He didn't move. "You haven't touched me, honey. I know you're scared, but you're not dangerous." He smiled at her. "You're just panicking. I can help you, but only if you meet me halfway." He was speaking more than figuratively. Sana swallowed. She stepped closer. Nothing happened. If anything, the lashing cloud shrank back. Sana's next couple of steps were as cautious as the first, but she all but threw herself into her dad's arms when she was in range. He caught her with an oof and wrapped her in a hug. He was much taller than Sana, and stronger, and he held her like the most precious thing in the world. She grabbed fistfuls of his shirt and sobbed into his chest. He ran his paralyzed hand through her hair and shushed her. Once her tears had subsided, he suggested, "Why don't we take this to the couch, and you can tell me how this happened. Okay, Peanut?" She nodded, but didn't lift her head. He half carried her there, and they rearranged themselves until they were both comfortable. Sana wound up half on top of her dad, but he made no comment. Instead, he rubbed her back in slow, soothing strokes. "Tell me what happened," he said. The story came out in fits and starts. She had to stop altogether when she reached Lord Static's final moments. Too ashamed to face him, she buried her face in her dad's shoulder. He didn't stop rubbing her back. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. "Get rid of them." The response was immediate. "They're dangerous. I'm dangerous. Lord Static died before the transfer, but there has to be another way. And if there isn't, then I'll learn to control them." Steady determination rose and swept away the last remnants of fear. "I refuse to let these things cause any more harm than they already have."